What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and in this video I'm going to be discussing why I'm not going to be covering the so-called unlimited vampire format DCR. Now, if you don't know, on my channel I cover various retro formats, and whenever I cover the main sort of formats, I generally go back and cover what they'd be like if they used the previous limited list, because a lot of the times these packs released before the limited list dropped to then curtail the new releases. So, there was a hypothetical period where you could play with all the cards from the new pack unlimited. Now, oftentimes, there's no official formats associated with this because generally formats are tied to specific events that take place. I mean, think of Edison. Edison's tied to SJC Edison, which is, a specific event. And so they play based on the releases and what was legal at that event. So the issue comes with that in the early DM era, that there wasn't a lot of documentation of events at that time. And while you do occasionally see formats built around an event from the DM era, Yada format is a great example, as that is Worlds 2003. A lot of the time, like if you go before that, you don't really have like concrete events to point to. So in my sort of approach to this channel, I sort of took the approach like, okay, let's look at just, whenever a new release or limited list dropped, and let's call that a format. And of course, as documentation becomes more firm and formats become more well-defined, we'll sort of shift away from that. But at this point in the game, you could, continue to do this, and that's what we're going to be doing. However, some formats don't quite merit a full sort of breakdown or, sort of duels getting shown off for them. For instance, the sort of McDonald's pack format was another example. When I covered Imperial format, basically we started covering it as pre-McDonald's pack, and then we got to McDonald's pack, and I basically made a video saying, like, these cards don't impact the game at all. So I'm not going to do a specific thing for the McDonald's cards, but if people want to play Imperial with the McDonald's cards and switch it over to that, then we'll do that. And that's basically what we did for Imperial. And they really don't impact the game in any meaningful ways that can really be shown easily in just a video showing off gameplay. I feel like Dark Crisis is in a sort of similar spot. So to explain what I mean by that, let's first talk about, the difference in card pools between Vampire Format and Dark Crisis. Now, there weren't too many differences here. The main differences are just the release of 3 promo cards, which I actually forgot to talk about in my Vampire guide. And those are Slate Warrior, Fairy King Truesdale, and Cypher Soldier, originally Kinetic Soldier. Now, these cards don't really impact the game that much. I mean, you don't really see them in Vampire Format decks, so I don't really think that they make a really big difference being absent from DCR format. But, it is something to mention, I guess, so I figured I'd mention that. And, of course, the biggest change here is the limited list. Now, the limited list was a bit different for the sort of unlimited DCR format. Vampire format uses the February 2004 TCG list, and if I just go down here in Dueling Book and change this to the November 2003 list, which Breaker used, you'll see most of the list stays the same, but there are some key exceptions that I want to point out. I think the biggest exception will be Magical Scientist, which is at 3 copies. So decks are able to play 3 copies of Magical Scientist. Now, this does boost, like, Scientist FDK. That deck does get better when Scientist is at 3 copies, of course, because you can draw into it more often. But I don't really think that the standing of that deck has changed super much as, it was in Breaker format. In Breaker format, the deck was very good, but it wasn't quite the best deck in the room, and in tournament settings, I couldn't quite be consistent enough to actually win. I feel like it will be similar in in Dark Crisis format, because, the main boost that the deck has gotten in terms of new cards in Dark Crisis is Spell Reproduction, which is a good card, don't get me wrong, but I don't really think it fixes a lot of the deck's key issues. Also, Dark Flare Knight did come in Dark Crisis as well, so that gives you a slightly bigger body to go into off Scientist, but it doesn't really change the math of your Scientist FDK that much. So I don't really think that Scientist FDK is too much improved from where it was in Breaker format, and so I don't really want to do a video on it here. I feel like it will be maybe tier 1, like bottom of tier 1, but I feel like it's more likely to be top of tier 2, just like it is in Vampire format. And, honestly, in Breaker format, maybe too. Although there is some debate about where that deck exactly lies in that format. But the changes that I assume that most people were most excited to see here are Vampire Lord and Reflect Bounder and Butterfly Dagger Elma all being unlimited. And these are probably the most notable changes to the list. These are the new cards from Dark Crisis, so it makes sense that, my main focus for this sort of video would be on these cards. Unfortunately, I think that, unlimiting these don't really change the math that much on the decks that would play them. To explain what I mean, let's just talk about Butterfly Dagger Elma first. Now, this card is mainly used in like Elma FDK decks, which are basically library FDK decks that use Elma as sort of a way to eventually just get infinite draws. If you get library and Gearfried on field and you've got Butterfly Dagger Elma, you can just keep equipping it to Gearfried, keep putting counters on Royal Magical Library, and just draw your entire deck. Now, I think that having more than one Elma could be something that those decks experiment with, just, playing 2 or potentially 3 copies of it. But the thing is, with a deck like that, it has to be really fine-tuned, and you really can't afford to play too many copies of a certain card. Like, those decks are generally only just playing one breaker, or not breaker, one Gearfried, because Gearfried is, a brick if you draw multiples of it, so you just want to really play one. I feel like Elma would be in a similar sort of situation. Now, there are some things you can do here, like if you draw MSTs, the Elmas can basically turn those on, and basically get you multiple counters on library just by MSTing your own Elma. So maybe that's a reason to play 2 of it. But I don't think that including multiple copies of this will really make the deck like super more consistent. And I think the flaws of the deck, namely that it can't really play into interaction. So you've just got to rely basically solely on the FTK, and the FTK doesn't always go off. I think those flaws will still be present. So I don't think that including multiple Elma will really make too big of a difference. Next would be a Vampire Lord. And I think that having this unlimited, zombie players will be very happy that this card's unlimited. But if we just look at the Vampire Format zombie list, then you can probably see why I don't think this will really make that big of an impact. So this is the zombie deck that I showed off in Vampire Format, and I do think that this is a pretty decent deck. It uses Skill Drain to show off your opponent's DD Warrior Ladies, so that way things like Giant Rat, Pyramid Turtle, etc. will be able to use their effects. But I don't necessarily think that having more than one Vampire Lord here will make the deck super better, because you're generally happy just playing one as a target to bring out off a Pyramid Turtle or Giant Rat. Or not Giant Rat, but you go Giant Rat into Pyramid Turtle into Vampire Lord. So effectively, Giant Rat can search out Vampire Lord as well. But the main reason why I think that this deck wouldn't really play more than one copy is because you want it in deck as a search target off of Turtle. You don't want to draw this card, so it doesn't really make sense to play 2. I guess it can serve as a backup if your opponent like DD Warrior Ladies the first one, and you still have one in deck, potentially bring out off of Turtle. But I think it's very telling that we're not actually playing Patrician of Darkness, which is another 2k zombie that you can bring out off of Pyramid Turtle. We're not playing that in this deck, and I feel like you don't really want to play multiple tribute monsters in a deck like this. But, I'm sure that people would experiment with 2 or 3 copies of it. I just don't think that the zombie deck would really change too much, even if it is playing multiples. It would just get a little bit more bricky. And so I don't really think that Unlimited Vampire Lord will really change much. The last sort of card changed by this limited list is Reflect Bounder, which is now unlimited. And this card was limited probably out of fear that burn decks would make use of it. And, to be fair, having 3 of this as beater and as a monster that is annoying for your opponent to deal with without taking burn damage is, I guess, pretty decent for burn decks. But I don't really think that, based on how burn decks played in my Vampire Format list that I showed off, I don't really think that having 3 of this card would really make too big of a difference. I think actually the more impactful change on this list is actually something I haven't talked about yet, which is the fact that instead of being semi-limited, Morphing Jar is still limited. And I feel like having 2 Morphing Jars was very good for the burn decks that I showed off. And to explain what I mean by all this, let's just dive in to the burn list that I showed previously when covering Vampire Format. So this is the list that I played when covering burn in Vampire Format. It's basically a Panda burn list, kind of like how it plays in Goat. So you're basically using Gakugiri Panda in conjunction with the Jama Trios, Just Desserts, Secret Barrels, etc. To get massive amounts of burn damage into your opponent and with a big monster on field. Now, this deck does play 2 Morphing Jars because Morphing Jars are really good at, drawing into your powerful traps, into your good monsters. And also, this deck does use up a lot of resources by, playing all these traps and chaining them for big damage. So you do want a way to sort of refresh your resources with Morphing Jar. And that's why it is very, very essential in this deck. Now, Reflect Bounder could potentially get a spot here, I guess. Maybe in place of the Desk Koalas, as Desk Koalas have been kind of underwhelming in the past. But the fact that this deck wasn't initially playing Reflect Bounder should show that, Reflect Bounder doesn't quite meet this way that this deck plays. It kind of goes not counter to the playstyle, but doesn't really fit in the best with this playstyle. And so, like, you could play it, and it could potentially be something in this deck, but I think it's a very easily cuttable card from Burn. I don't really think it changes the math on Burn that much, especially when this Burn deck is just trying to basically go out by using Just Desert, Secret Barrels, Ojama Trios, Gyakigiri Pandas, etc. Doesn't really care that much about Reflect Bounder. So, I mean, Reflect Bounder could potentially help this, but I don't really think it will change the math on this deck too much. So that's why I'm not really showing off what Burn would look like with triple Reflect Bounder in Dark Crisis, as I don't necessarily think it would even use the triple Reflect Bounder. So hopefully after explaining all that, you can see why I don't really think that covering a DCR format would necessarily be the most informative or helpful on this channel. Generally, like, when you're making YouTube videos on this sort of thing, you basically want to show off things through gameplay, right? Because that is what communicates to the audience probably the best in a video format. You can analyze like all the subtle differences between the formats, you know, with these cards being at different limited statuses. But that doesn't really work well in this sort of format. And so I'm not going to be covering that. But I am curious about what your thoughts are on these things in the comments down below. I think that, you know, writing this sort of thing out and, you know, making detailed analysis like that can be very interesting and very important. So I am curious what people will say in the comments down below of this video. But that's basically why I'm not going to be covering this format before I dive into Chaos format, which should be coming very soon. So look forward to that. And also, if you enjoy gameplay videos or if you enjoy the retro format guides that I make, then definitely subscribe to the channel. I got a lot more of those coming on the way. Also, if you want to support me directly, I do have a Patreon, and big shout outs to Bren Donker and Rincewind for being my patrons. And if you do sign up for the Patreon, then you will get shouted out in these videos. So very exciting in that way. And I should have new tiers for the Patreon very soon, as well, as I put up a poll as to what people wanted to see there. And the poll results are in, so I'm going to make new tiers for that soon. So look forward for more perks in the future. But, you know, again, if you enjoyed this video, like down below. Also, let me know what you think about it. And until next time, I've been Ben from from Zero, and I'm signing off.